council meetings just what all of this is about. So ask a lot of questions, take some of this information with you, and follow up when it comes down to the adoption, which will probably take place early in the year 2010. So I'd like to introduce Carolyn, and Tyler.
Thank you, Dean, and thanks to all of you for allowing us to be here today to talk about Denver's new code project. I see a lot of familiar faces here, so some of you may be familiar with the project. Some of you may have come to some of our public meetings. If not, I hope you'll find the opportunity. But we will today try and give you a fairly concise overview of what the project is. Before introducing Caryn Wenzara, who is co-manager for the code project, I'd like to just give a little background on where we are. We're 4.5 years into this process of working with the Zoning Code Task Force and our public outreach process. So we definitely feel like we're in the home stretch. We're shooting for first quarter next year for adoption. 4.5 years sounds like a long time, but stop for a second to just consider the history of how long we've recognized and discussed the fact that we need a new code in Denver. The issue was first identified in the 1989 Comprehensive Plan, discussed again in Plan 2000, our update of the Comprehensive Plan in 2000. And in 2002, we adopted Blueprint Denver, which really set a new framework and foundation for our land use and transportation regulations. But why have we been talking about a major overhaul of our zoning for so long? What's the problem and why is it such a challenge? I think you need to think back to the very origins of zoning in Denver and in the United States. Denver adopted its first zoning code in 1923. The 1920s were a time of urban reform based on concerns over challenging, sometimes dismal living conditions and working conditions in many older cities across the country. It was the time of the infamous Robert Moses in New York City opening up the countryside with new parks and parkways. And zoning was a tool to enforce better urban living conditions by separating uses such as industrial, commercial, residential. And even into the 1990s, Denver's code still referred to such things as the packaging of coal, mirror silvering, koshering of chickens, things that had lasted in our code language from that time in the 1920s when those were important issues to deal with. Our most recent complete overhaul of the code was in 1956. Of course, the 50s were the beginning of the time of urban renewal. The mission of the day was kind of out with the old city and in with the new city of freeways and high-rises. This illustration we discovered in a back closet of the building was, believe it or not, that was a vision of Denver. We're not sure exactly the year, but there isn't much left there in that downtown that we would recognize today. Lower downtown is that group of high-rises. There's a freeway cutting off downtown from Capitol Hill. So most of the old city was thought of as expendable in many ways in 1956. So Denver was rezoned at that time without regard for the successful and well-loved qualities of the existing city. For the last couple of decades, at least, there's been a joke that while we rewrote the code in 1956, we've amended it every Monday night at City Council since then. And the endless amending of the code into this sort of Rube Goldberg system of fixes and counterfixes was a sure sign that the very basis of the current code was not serving us well. We recognize that much of the tension in the current code comes from a combination of both a lack of recognition and respect for those valued qualities of our existing city, as well as a lack of ability to adapt to the new forms and development that better fit our current needs. So with that introduction, I'd like to now introduce Caryn Wenzara, co-manager of the code, to describe our approach to the new code.
Thank you, Tyler. Good afternoon. So as Tyler mentioned, this process started about 4.5 years ago, at least in terms of the actual code update. It's been years in the making. But so what we wanted to do with the first part of the process was spend a lot of time with the public and the Zoning Code Task Force in make sure that there was a uniform understanding of the problems that we're solving, because, as Tyler mentioned, this document is about 1,000 pages. We could do a lot to update it, but I think we wanted to make sure that this is going to be an effective process and an effective product, we had to be very clear about the problems that we're solving and the approach that we're going to take to solving them. Because there's a lot of things to tackle, and there's a lot of different ways that we could do it. So the first couple of years was a lot of public outreach and listening sessions to really understand what are we trying to achieve with this process. So the first 3 phases of the project was problem identification and developing the approach. And I'll talk about what the approach that they agreed on in a moment. And as Tyler mentioned, we're in the home stretch. We're in the final phase of the project. Now we're in the public review and hopefully initiating the adoption process the end of this year. Sorry. So to talk through in a little bit more detail in terms of the problems that we're solving and the approach that we're taking to solve those, the first thing we wanted to talk about is the current code is one size fits all. As Tyler mentioned, in the 1950s, there was an approach to zoning that presumed wipe away everything that exists and replace it with new. And not only did they say replace it with new, but the approach was to replace it with a very auto-dominant and auto-oriented design and approach to development. And now what we're certainly identifying as part of this process is that the city has developed in different ways. There are older parts of the city that have a very urban feel, and there's different parts of the city that have more of a suburban, more auto-oriented feel. And to have one set of regulations to apply to very different neighborhoods in the city wasn't suiting our needs, and that's why there's been so many patchwork fixes over the last few years. We have overlay districts to try to clean that up. We've got lots of planned unit developments and zoning that has waivers and conditions and development agreements and all of these fixes because our current code is a one-size-fits-all approach. So with the new code, we're taking a context-based approach. And what that means is we're taking a look at the different neighborhood contexts or the neighborhood types in our city and tailoring the regulations to fit those neighborhood types. So a little bit more detail about that. For example, the picture on the left-hand side is in the Park Hill neighborhood. It's what you might envision as a neighborhood main street. The picture on the right-hand side is also a neighborhood commercial center, but it's located along Colorado Boulevard. And you can see they have very different characteristics. One is built at the street, one is very pedestrian-oriented. The other certainly accommodates the automobile and kind of that drive-by traffic along a busy arterial. But yet they're both zoned the same. They both have a B2 zoning, which means they're held to the same set of regulations and the same parking standards and the same kind of design elements. So the example on the left-hand side actually doesn't meet the standards of the B2 zoning. So those businesses and those buildings are non-conforming. So anytime they want to reinvest in their property or reinvest in their business, they have to go through additional process and additional steps just in order to do that. And what we found and we recognize is that, yes, those are two very different business areas, both important to the city and both unique to different areas of the city. So why should they be zoned the same? Our context-based approach allows for those different areas to be zoned differently and held to different standards. So for example, the main street on the left, the setback could be built to, and there'd be shop fronts required and entrances at the street and less parking required, if any at all. Whereas the example on the right, there would be setbacks required, there would be parking and screening and things like that. This also applies in our residential neighborhoods as well. So if you're familiar with the R1 zoning, that's a single-family zone district that we have on the books today, and a lot of our neighborhoods in Denver are zoned for single-family. But yet, if you live in Denver or certainly familiar with it, we have very different neighborhoods in this city. We have urban neighborhoods, just as the one on the left-hand side, where you've got alleys, you've got buildings are closer to the street, you have sidewalks that are detached, there's on-street parking, there's street trees, whereas we also have neighborhoods like on the right-hand side where there aren't alleys, it's more curvilinear streets, maybe even cul-de-sacs, and access to the home there is a front-loaded garage and you access from the street as opposed to an alley. So we have both of these in our city, but yet again, they have the same zoning and they're held to the same set of standards. Now, certainly they're both single unit, and that's important, but they shouldn't be held to the same setback